Hello, I'm Shubh Rohilla and I'm going to talk about Indian Forest Act 1927. But before getting right into it, let us understand forest and forestry in India. The word forest is derived from a Latin word foris, means outside. Forests are important global resources that provide a wide range of environmental, economic, and social benefit. They provide a variety of valuable products such as timber, fuel wood, resin, fiber, and other wood and non-wood products, and they also contribute heavily in the livelihood of rural communities. Now, do remember that last line, we are going to discuss it later. India is one of the 10 most forest rich countries in the world. India's forest cover was estimated to be 22% of the country's area in 2010. It has increased to almost 25% in 2019. India's forests include 17 different types of forest, out of which 3 accounts for more than 75% of India's total forest area. These forest types are tropical dry deciduous, tropical moist deciduous, and tropical thorns. Now that we have a basic idea of what is forest and what's the situation in India, let's get into the act. This act was enacted on 21st September 1927. Let us understand the history. This act is largely based on the previously implemented Indian Forest Acts by the British government, especially Indian Forest Act 1878. Previous acts empowered British government to declare any land cover with trees as government forest. Forest produce, especially teak wood, were back then, because this was the era of railways into India. So the teak wood were used largely for railway manufacturing. Now these railways were later used to exploit our resources, the Indian resources, and take them to England for the greater glory of England, right? Obviously, once the Britishers left, we were able to use the railways for different purposes like passenger commute and yeah, we'll talk about it later. Let's get into the preamble of this act. An act to consolidate the law relating to forests, the transit of forest produce, and the duty leviable on timber and other forest produce. So this really sums up this act. This act consolidate the laws relating to forest land, and any transfer of forest produce from one place to another, and it also talks about how much duty will be leviable on timber or other forest produce. It also defines the procedures to be followed for declaring any area to be reserved forest, a protected forest, or a village forest. We'll talk about what each one of these in our later slides. The main objective of this act includes regulation, heavy regulation of rights of various groups, of transfer of forest produce, and it also talks about the authorities for enforcement of this act, like authorities of forest officer or a forest settlement officer. It also covers penalties to any forest offense. It, as I just told you, that it talks about the procedures to declare a forest and to resolve any issues while declaring a forest, right? And it also includes prohibited acts in different types of forests. So this was the basic introduction of this act. Now let's get a step further to get a brief outline of this act. This act is made up of 13 chapters with a total of 86 sections. The outline is such as you can see it on my screen. Now let's get into each aspect of this act, and let's take brief. This act defines or divides the forest into 3 different types: reserved forest, village forest, or protected forest. Reserved forests are the most restrictive forest among all these 3. These are declared by state government, and the government is the direct owner of this forest. Government has all the rights over forest, the land, and the forest producers. Village forests are nothing but reserved forest, but some of the rights, considering that village depends, the livelihood of that village depends on the forest or the forest produce, some rights are given to the village. Now these are called village forest. Protected forests are still owned by government, but they are not reserved. They still have some prohibited activities, and the government still has defined some rules and regulations for these kind of for these kind of forests. Now the forests that are not owned by the government and they are not reserved, those types of forest falls into the category of non-government forests. Basically these forests include any private forest, might be owned by some company or anyone, right? So this was about the forest. The procedures of declaring forest. There is this is the general procedure of whenever the government declares a land to be a forest. This is the general procedure. So the state government issues the notification and assigns a forest settlement officer to that land. Right now, imagine someone living in the forest for many years, and now suddenly that land is now declared as a reserved forest by the government. Where will that person go? That person can claim the ownership of land and can go to the forest settlement officer. Then the forest settlement officer will inquire and will proceed by doing a settlement by claim. If that individual is not happy with this settlement, he can appeal further to higher authorities such as collector or estate. So this was the general procedure. We talked about the claims. This act also talks about what are the claims that will be entertained by this act. So the forest dweller may claim the ownership of land, but I just took an example of an individual living in the forest. Second is a claim may be asserted for rights to pasture or forest produce. Now these claims can be done by someone whose livelihood depends on the forest and forest produce. Final is the special provision applied to the practice of shifting cultivation. Now in this case, the FSO, the forest settlement officer, have special rights. He may prohibit the action without any compensation. Now keep this in mind that forest settlement officer have many rights over anybody, right? This act also talks about the transfer of forest produce. State have all the control and state makes the rules. State makes the fees if there is any to be taken for making this transfer. State can penalize this offense. I mean forest offense in general. State can penalize it, can define what will be the punishment, what will be the fine. There is also a section 39 which talks about the central government, with the power of central government to impose duty on timber and other forest produce. Authorities. Now as we talked, that forest settlement officer have many authorities. Similarly, forest rangers, forest officers also have many powers given to them on ground. So these are the power to officer. Forest officer has many power on ground, especially of a rank superior to that of a ranger. Now forest settlement officer is basically superior to the ranger. So these are the rights listed: arrest without warrant, power to release on bond person arrested, power to confiscate timber of forest produce, power to prevent commission of offense, power to try offenses summarily, power to compound offense. Right, so as you can see, there are many powers given to the forest officers on ground. Right, so this was the basic outline of this act. Now let's understand some drawbacks and what perception this act gives. One of the biggest drawbacks that I saw was in this act of 1927, there is a striking feature, that is the absence of any definition of forest or forest land. How interesting this is, that this act is known as Indian Forest Act, but it does not include any explicit forest definition or the definition of forest land. In 1996, there was a case, T.N. Godavarman versus Union of India. This is also known as the forest case, and the Supreme Court delivered a landmark judgment and gave us the definition of forest. The Supreme Court said and emphasized that the word forest should be understood according to its dictionary meaning of the term, irrespective of the nature of ownership. Any forest thus defined, regardless of the ownership, would subject to this act and also to the Act of Forest Conservation Act 1980. This judgment also gave more power to central government, where in the judgment it said that all forest activities throughout the country without the specific approval of the central government must cease forthwith. It also posed a complete ban on tree cuts and transfer, and also the licenses given to all wood-based industries shall stand cancelled. This was also in this act. This was also in this judgment. Now this judgment was again referred to not in a court case but a famous parliamentary query in 2018. The committee asked the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change to, about the definition of the forest, because it was still not defined. So the reply was, as you can see it on your screen, sir, actually if we define forest, it could create many loopholes that may exploited. So right now we are going with the definition of definition given by the Supreme Court. Now this is the reference to this 1996 case. As of now, forest means any area that is recorded as forest in governmental records, irrespective of whether it is having a forest growth or not. You can see I have highlighted the reference. Also, in the final recommendation, the committee agreed with the ministry's fear that any narrow and specific definition of forest may leave out a certain type of forest and open up the possibility of loopholes being exploited by vested interest. However, it recommended that the ministry must come out with a comprehensive, clear-cut, legally sustainable definition of forest to dispel any kind of doubts in this regard. If you do a deep investigation of this act, it might seem to you that this act is not talking about vegetation cover in India or protection of that. It is talking about regulating the timber and forest produce, the cutting of trees, and earning revenue from the same. This act of 1927 also denied common ownership of occupancy rights and property rights to occupant of land or tribals. Right? This you remember we talked about how Britishers used this law to exploit our hinterland. Now the revenue oriented attitude toward the forest has continued even after independence. No rights of forest dwellers. In case of dispute, the forest settlement officer has all the rights to decide the claim, as we talked about it before. So basically there are many rights given to forest settlement officer on ground. This was the Indian Forest Act 1927. In the end, to give a way forward and to conclude this, I think it would be apt for me to use the words of Luc Ferry, who is a philosopher, who said that the world we have treated as an object has become a subject again. Thank you.